this is a new quote, and it's new today, from Forbes magazine. It says, "Not only is the Penn Museum the most underrated attraction in Philadelphia, these ancient alcohol events are inspired, full of games and trivia, and sure to engage people who want to learn a little more about what, when, and where, and why, and how our ancestors imbibed alcohol." It's $15 per viewing.
Per screen.
So get a bunch of friends together. The suggested tastings are on the website, which we'll attach, and hope we see you there. It sounds like a lot of fun.
I'm Sal.
I'm Beth.
We're the brewery lovers in the brew garage. Look at this. Actually brewing today. A little bit different because we have a special guest joining us virtually, Mark Van Horn from the University of Pennsylvania, who is an expert in, you're an archaeologist, right? Anthropologist?
I am an archaeologist, yes.
And he knows a lot about beer and ancient alcohol. In fact, he is presenting a program a week from today, Friday, the 19th.
November 19th from 6 to 8 p.m.
And it's virtual, so anybody can join from anywhere.
It's virtual.
Mark's going to be in Italy. I'm jealous.
It'll be a fantastic time. I just need to hope that the Wi-Fi holds.
Right, exactly. Well, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, of course. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So Mark is like running to get on a plane, so we really appreciate him taking the time to be with us. We are in the brew garage because we're actually brewing today. We're brewing an ESB, and we have appropriate English.
Yep, it's raining.
It's raining, but it's not too cold, fortunately. I thought we'd be all bundled up in here, but it's not bad. It doesn't get cold till tomorrow. So tell us about ancient alcohol next Friday night.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to give this program. This is a natural development of a few virtual tours that the Penn Museum has started since the COVID-19 pandemic began in early 2020 for most of the US. We started with a virtual version of what began as an in-person tour, which I helped to create shortly after I started at Penn, which is just all about ancient alcohol in the Penn Museum's galleries. And so that was something that you could pair with a beer tasting at the end of the tour, and a graduate student guide or someone else would take you through the galleries and show you objects that were on display at the Penn Museum and add some context to them and kind of give you a tour of ancient alcohol as it was shown in the Penn Museum's galleries. And it was immediately one of our more popular tours, as you could imagine. And so we decided to create a virtual version of this to continue presenting during the shutdown of the museum. And so the first version was kind of beer and wine. And then there was a second version that was just kind of ancient wine. And so now this is the kind of culmination of the triangle where this is a focus on ancient beer. So I have kind of modified the original tour. And what's really nice about this virtual format, and part of the reason that I would encourage everyone who is available to come, is not only because you don't have to be in Philadelphia to attend, which is the best reason, maybe. You can do it from anywhere in the world. But also because we're not taking you on a tour through the gallery specifically, we're able to show you objects that are in the Penn Museum's storerooms and that haven't actually been on display for decades even. And so it's a really different look at some of the collections that the Penn Museum has compared to what you might see if you just walk in as a visitor.
Oh, that's awesome. So we're going to get a sneak peek at some stuff you wouldn't normally see.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm really excited to talk about some of that stuff.
What kind of artifact? I'm curious.
A lot of them are kind of ceramic vessels that have either been used for either ritual or kind of casual alcohol drinking over the course of thousands of years in different parts of the world. We also have a few like minor statues or figurines, which are really cool. There are some tomb carvings from ancient Egypt, which are really exciting to look at. And so it's really kind of all different kinds of evidence, both from kind of an art history lens, an archaeological physical object lens. There's a little bit of like written text material that's there. And then there's also a lot of chemical analysis and kind of also like a crash course in what is fermentation as a process. How did people discover fermentation and what kind of drove humans to actually want to do this all the time?
Didn't do it on purpose.
Yeah.
So we spent time with salt cats many years ago, and he was the one that told us that one of the first things humans ever wrote was a beer recipe. Is that true?
As far as I know, it's some of the earliest material we have. Yeah. I am more experienced in kind of the Near East and the Mediterranean world. That's where my specialization lies. And so I can't speak to ancient China, which is where the earliest writing
Okay.
that we have in a lot of cases is from.
We were talking about Sumeria.
Sumeria,
Back then. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a lot of beer recipes from Sumeria. We have, hymns to the goddess of beer, which is awesome. I love that they have a complete dedicated goddess of beer. Because you think about like Dionysus in the Greek world or something, but he represents a lot more than just wine. That's kind of like the SparkNotes simplification of Dionysus. But Ninkasi is just a goddess of beer, which is fantastic.
Ninkasi, yeah, I remember that name. Well, it always fascinates me because beer is technical, and this is nothing against wine because wine is amazing, but I mean, all you have to do to make wine is crush the grapes. You don't have to do anything else. It may not be good wine, but the fact that you have to convert barley to a different form of starch and then convert it again to sugar, and it's a process, and it's amazing to me how the ancient peoples figured that out.
One of the kind of fun interactives that I'm going to try to convince people to do during this tour is to actually take coarse ground cornmeal and put it in their mouths and start to chew on it.
That reminds me, so we don't give him short shrift. Tell us about your partner in this, your co-presenter.
Oh, my co-presenter. Yes. So I will be joined by So I did a digital interview with Kirk French, who is a fantastic professor of anthropology at Penn State, and I met him during my time there. And he won't be able to join live, but he will have a recorded appearance, and there will be all kinds of links to his material if you want to follow up. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of the work that he's been doing recently, but he kind of did a hard pivot from his earlier topics in anthropology to kind of an anthropological study of alcohol, which is really, really interesting. And so he's done various kinds of things that are trying to get college undergrads excited about anthropology using a medium that they're more familiar with, right? Like beer. Obviously, it's a huge topic at Penn State. So one of the really cool case studies, for instance, that he has done previously, and we don't talk about this in the tour, so I'm happy to give a little bit more detail on it now because it's one of my favorite examples to give to people, is drone photography has become really, really popular in archaeology to help kind of map large spaces or kind of scales of areas that you can't get good photographs of from the ground. And so what he's done with some of his classes before is they've actually gone out to the tailgating lots on a Sunday morning after a Penn State football game, and they've done drone photography of the kind of remnants of all the tailgates and kind of done trash pickups of discarded alcohol bottles and things like this, and actually measured and counted the types of alcohol and the different discards in different areas. And they've done an actual kind of archaeological study of alcohol consumption as it relates to Penn State football games, which is so cool because all archaeology is really looking at ancient people's trash. And so it's the same concept, just moved, to yesterday instead of 2,000 years ago.
So your successor 1,000 years from now is going to have some great data if it survived.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, with as long as plastics stay in the world, are you kidding? So, I mean, that's the nice thing about ceramics too. As problematic as these long-term materials are, ceramics are kind of like an ancient plastic because when you make them, you actually create a chemical reaction that changes the clay into a very firm, solid substance, and you can't degrade ceramic like that. You can keep breaking it, but I just call it the gift that keeps on giving because if you break it, you just get more ceramic. It doesn't ever break down. So
yeah, even if you ground it up, it would still be porcelain, not clay, right?
Yeah, exactly. You could get it really, really fine, even though depending on what sort of thing you're grinding up, you can only get it so fine. But even if you make it really, really fine like that, it's still like a chemically altered product. So,
yep. Right.
And it's been super important for the study of ancient alcohol because ceramics are also conveniently very porous. And so if a material has stayed in them for a long time, it will actually kind of soak into the ceramic body of the sherd. And this is actually how a lot of Pat McGovern's work with recreating the ancient ale series with Dogfish Head has happened, is because you can actually scrape out layers of the bottom of the vessel and put it into like a laser mass spectrometer, which will give you readings for the types of elements and molecules that have like wound themselves into the fabric of the vessel. And because they've permeated into it, they're actually protected and they're kind of stabilized there for thousands of years.
Can I just say that's the first time laser mass spectrometer came up in one of our fields?
I'm always happy to give firsts.
So did you know when you were like a little kid that you wanted to dig up artifacts and dinosaur bones, or what attracted you to this field?
You know, that's a really good question. If you had asked me, I would not have known. But when I think back about it now, the signs were always there. When I went into undergrad, I wanted to be a history teacher, like a high school history teacher. And so I've always really, really loved history. I've always really loved teaching people. And even as I've been in the PhD program at Penn, one of my favorite parts has always been instruction and teaching, both in a classroom and in kind of like a public scholarship sense. So these kind of tours, for instance, and I do other work at the Penn Museum quite often. I give a lot of in-person tours. So if either of you ever come to the Penn Museum and you'd like a tour, by all means. So public scholarship and outreach is really important to me. But thinking back, beyond just teaching, when I was a little kid, there are two things that stick out in my mind that really told me, like, I should have known better. I should have known that I was going to love archaeology. And the first one is there were these kind of cross-section books that my parents would always buy me as a very small child. And as you would turn the page, it would kind of like layer up different time periods, and you can see all the remnants in a cross section underneath, and it would have like a little house that had burnt down, and then you can see the remnants of the house, like all drawn as a cartoon. And these existed for that sort of stuff, but also for like, there was really famous like cross section books of the Titanic or something. And so that just got me really into the idea of like layering of material. But then on a more practical standpoint, I remember as a little kid, I grew up in the area of southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm a local. And I would always make my parents drive me up to Dorney Park. And rather than riding any rides there when I was a kid, I would just get on like the little child like hand excavators, and I would just move dirt between piles back and forth for hours at a time. And like, if that doesn't tell you that I'm destined for a career that involves moving a lot of dirt, I don't know what would, because that is just, I didn't even realize I did that to them until a few years ago when they told me. And I was like, oh my God, it all makes sense.
That's fantastic. Great story. So we are, when I say we, I mean Beth. Beth is prepared for this because we grabbed some of the beers that you recommended.
Oh, great.
So why don't you...
So I love that you gave us guidelines of exactly what we should be drinking. And it looks like a huge volume. We might have to grab another couple here. This is going to be a lot of beer for 2 hours. So we picked as our local from Ashton Brewing. We're currently in Trenton. So this is in Middlesex, New Jersey. We've tried their stuff. We love it. It's local. Your next guideline is a rice beer or lager.
Wait, you didn't tell them what it was.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
It's a red ale.
It's a red ale.
It's called Scarlet.
And there's a Rutgers logo on here. They're the Scarlet Knights.
They're right near New Brunswick, so.
Okay, nice.
They're in Scarlet Knights country.
Your next suggestion is a rice beer or lager. So we grabbed a Sapporo, which this is not something that we would normally pick up and try. We've had it at some time with Chinese food, but so it's good that we're acclimating our palate for something like that.
So actually part of if I can just interject a little bit about the selection process, I was really excited to put either Tsingtao or Sapporo on the list because it's not something I would normally drink either. And this is a tour that I think attracts a lot of people who are really into beer. And I think people who are really into beer tend to overlook beers like Sapporo or Tsingtao. And so I'm just excited to like bring a very like light kind of lagery drink into a mix of other very heavy beers. And so it's just like the whole tour of everything.
And it's perfect timing for us because we are going through the BJCP guidelines book. maybe considering taking the test. So we're right now kind of in the process of buying beers that we don't normally buy because we're just IPA people, IPA all the way.
Okay.
We're buying all kinds of stuff that we wouldn't have to buy because we have to learn all the nuances of the different beers for the judging process. So this is a perfect opportunity. Your talk Friday is outstanding.
Yeah, I'm glad to help at least in that case.
What's next?
Your next guide was American wheat. So we grabbed an Allagash White.
Yeah, that's a quality.
That's one of my favorite beers. I love Allagash.
Yeah, good stuff.
Well, good. I'm glad we're picking stuff that you approve of. We're going to grab a Guinness. I did not grab one of those last night. I assumed we already had some in the refrigerator, but apparently not. The next one, see, now this is big. This is why I'm worried. This is a lot of beer for two of us. So the next one is the Lindemans Lambic.
Yeah, how do you pronounce it?
I've always just said Lambic, although I'm not, despite the name Van Horn, I'm not Dutch or Belgian in any way. So I'm sure that I could be corrected by someone who is from the area. But yeah, that's something I've found more recently. They've started selling it at a lot of the kind of grocery stores in Center City, Philadelphia, where I live. And I really, really like sour beer, and I really, really like fruity beer. And so that just immediately was a huge hit for me. And I started thinking of all the ways that I could integrate it stylistically with a tour like this.
I'm looking forward to that because I haven't had a Lindemans, right? A Lindemans Lambic, and I can't even remember the last time I had one. So, and my palate has changed so much over those years. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's been a long, long time. What's next?
And this was the one that was a little bit more of a challenge to find.
Oh, we lucked out though. We got it.
But you said mead, or then you specifically stated flying fish, exit 3, blueberry, braggot.
Got it.
We found it.
Yeah, so that's going to be definitely the hardest to find. I actually just tried it for the first time yesterday. It's something that I kind of worked with a few of the people who helped to kind of market and manage these tours to find a replacement for, because originally here we had Midas Touch from the Ancient Ale series that Dogfish Head does. Unfortunately, around March or April of this year, they discontinued Midas Touch, which I'm really, really sad about, because just beyond the history of it, which obviously appeals to me, I just love Midas Touch as a beer. It had such an interesting grape flavor, and it was very sweet. And it was so unique as far as beer was concerned. So unfortunately, they've discontinued that. If there's any around on a store that you happen to find, I would swipe it up as soon as possible if you've never had it. But this is probably the next closest thing that we could find, in that it's a fruity, heavy beer. And a braggot is maybe even a better description for the sort of beer that we're trying to evoke stylistically than a mead would be.
For those of the folks in our audience who don't know what a braggot is.
Yeah, we had to look it up.
We had to look it up. Why don't you define it?
So a braggot is kind of like a mead, but extra. It's like I kind of think of it as like a mead taken to the extreme, where in some ways it is very beery, and in other ways it is definitely something that is very fruity, and they tend to be very, very heavy, similar to meads, because they have a large component of honey and other kind of sugar additives in addition to just malted fermentation product. And so you just get a lot of fermentation that's happening in these things. And so the blueberry braggot that we recommend is 15% alcohol. It's very, very strong. But I will say you can taste alcohol, but it tastes really good. And for something with blueberry in the name, it was less blueberry heavy than I expected, I think.
I'm looking forward to that one too, because it's one that I never would have bought.
Yeah. So if you think of a mead where, honey's your main sugar that you're adding, a braggot is kind of like a mead that you're using honey, but it's usually more commonly like a half and a half honey and
some kind of malt.
Some kind of malt product. Yeah, so it's kind of, it's almost as like you're mixing a mead and a heavy beer.
So do we know, I'm going to put you on the spot, do we know is beer or mead, which is older? Are they parallel histories in terms of development?
So yeah, so this is a really good question, and this is something that I talk a little bit around in the tour, I would say, but I'm trying to fit as much information into an hour and a half as possible because the academic in me wants to be very instructive while also balancing, the fact that people are going to be drinking a lot and it needs to be fun and interesting even when you're kind of drunk. Because as you mentioned, this is a lot of alcohol. And when we gave the first version of this tour, it was something that like we didn't think about mentioning that. And so it kind of snuck up on people, I think. And so now it's kind of advertised such that like a 6-pack is good for like 2 or 3 people who are watching. But now, as you know, with like the framboise, that's a much larger bottle than a lot of the other kind of cans or 12 or 16 ounce bottles that we've had before. The braggot is 15%. And so it is a lot of beer. So I would definitely not, shy away from inviting more people to split your fill. So we do talk about this. Sorry, I got sidetracked. I get too excited.
All good.
We do talk a little bit about what is older. And the answer is, unfortunately, they're kind of all roughly equal. And that's because our evidence for earliest alcohol, which comes from China, the site of Jiahu is the oldest confirmed alcohol that we have in the world. And what's really telling is that it uses rice in its fermentation process. And the rice, we actually have archaeological evidence of 9,000-year-old rice that comes from the same site because when it's burned in a fire, it can survive as kind of like this carbonized husk. And these rice grains that have survived are so old that many of them are actually wild rice, or it's rice that are just showing some of the first signs of domestication. And so as soon as rice is being domesticated and agriculture is starting in this central plain of China, they're making beer out of it, which is amazing to begin with. But then, for instance, there's also evidence of tartaric acid in the vessels, which is some kind of fruit. It's present in fruit, most commonly grapes. And so like in the Middle East or in the Mediterranean, when we find evidence for tartaric acid, it's very easy to say, okay, grapes. So this is some kind of wine product. In China, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there's 30 some varieties of wild grapes that exist in China, but none of them were ever domesticated around this period of time. And other wild fruits like the hawthorn fruit, for instance, could easily be used and give the same kind of chemical signature. And so we don't really know what kind of fruit is going into these things. It could be hawthorn, it could be grape. It's a little unclear. And so these earliest beverages already are kind of a mix between wine and beer in the more traditional sense. And so that's why something like this braggot or something like a mead where you have a lot of honey and sweetness like that, those are maybe some of the most accurate to ancient drinks that you can get. Something with a lot of fruit, something that's maybe a bit sour or funky, because they're all wild fermented beverages. And so beer or wine or mead, like what comes first, it's really hard to say because these are all kind of combination drinks.
That's a good answer. Because the answer is we're not sure, but we know they were doing something.
Exactly, yeah.
What's the time period? Like, what's the earliest that we know? What's the earliest evidence we have?
The earliest evidence from China is about 9,000 years ago, so 7,000 BCE. It's the late Neolithic period in China, yeah. In the Near East, for instance, we have evidence that we have potential evidence, I should say. It's not confirmed. There is some hinting evidence just after that period in China that people have started making some kind of beer product. And that's before the Middle East even has pottery. Wow. To give you an idea of how old of a technology this is. It's stone vessels that have been carved out and have evidence for beer stone on the inside of them.
Wow.
But that's kind of a tentative attribution. So this stuff is, it's really old. And then we even get a little bit into, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, a few years, maybe I think a little over a decade ago, I can't quite think of the date right now. An anthropologist proposed the drunken monkey hypothesis, which we get into a little bit in the tour. I don't know if either of you have ever heard of that.
No.
I have.
You have?
Well, it's in my book.
Oh, right. She's reading
Not
Tara.
my book.
She's reading Tara.
I'm reading A Woman's Place is in the Brew House.
I just ordered that book, but I haven't been able to start it yet because of all this research travel nonsense. Is it good?
It is good.
That's so exciting.
Very informative. She jumps back between, 9,000 years ago and last week. So it's so much fun to read.
Well, Mark, you and Beth talk about Drunken Monkeys, and I'm going to go stir the mash.
All right, sounds good. No, so yeah, I love this idea of, for anyone who's maybe not familiar with it, this is something that we will talk a bit more about in the tour on Friday. But it's this idea that, when fruit fall down from trees and they become overripe, all the sugars that are in this fruit naturally occurring they start to ferment on the kind of forest floor, because any kind of wild yeast in the air, either when the fruit is forming or that kind of gets into the fruit once it falls and bursts from being too ripe, will start to actually ferment the fruit. And eventually, after a few days, you'll get these like kind of fruit husks that are laying on the ground of the forest that are maybe 2 or 3% alcohol content. And monkeys preferentially love these things. And so there's an argument that actually genetically humans are predisposed to hunt out these alcoholic fruits because of the shared ancestry with great apes. And it's just because, it was great for us, 400,000 years ago. It's maybe not so great for me today, but alcohol is very calorically dense. And that used to be an evolutionary advantage. Yeah.
Absolutely true. I never even thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a evolutionary advantage to having a beer gut.
Absolutely. Yeah. Talk about a caloric reserve. Am I right?
And it was safer than water.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. So this is a really cool idea, but it shows you like the idea of alcohol just goes so far back. And when something like that happens, you can really see how this process of fermenting, even though, like you said before, like it's really technical, but on the same hand, you can kind of just let nature run its course, and you're not going to get something that tastes anything like what we drink today. But at the same time, you'll get something alcoholic and different.
Right. Yeah, it's very cool. Okay, we talked about the braggot. We talked about the lambic, which lambic, by the way, we didn't really define that. That's a beer that is spontaneously fermented. So there's like, whether it's here or over in Belgium where it started, the yeast is just kind of in the air and it lives in the brewery. It's been there for 400 years or whatever, especially in Europe, not here. And they have a large open vessel that they put the wort in. The wort is the unfermented beer. They let it cool. All these yeast spores that are just floating around inoculate the wort. And what's really interesting about lambic is that the microbes that are in there change as the beer ages. So the populations ebb and flow, and there's dozens of different yeasts and bacteria that they've identified in lambic, which is, a lot of people love it because it's very complex, but it is on the sour side. I don't know if I'd call it 100% sour, but what would you say?
No, it's not sour in like the traditional sense of sour. It's not going to give you like the punch of something that you just like, really like hit over the head with like a bunch of pediococcus or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Forward to that one. So tell us the American wheat. What else? The ones we didn't talk about. No, but you didn't tell us why you picked them. Why did you pick American wheat? You mentioned that you wanted people to try the light lagers, but tell us your motivation behind that.
Yeah. So okay. So I can give like a brief sort of quick mention of the thought process behind choosing some of these things. That was one of my favorite parts. Was choosing all of these beers and trying to relate them both to the taste of what some of these ancient things may or may not have tasted like, because some of them probably wouldn't have been very good. And so you don't always just want to chase the taste. But especially kind of the ingredients and the methods are most what I was thinking about when I chose this kind of beer list. And so, for instance, the rice beers at the beginning, I chose them because they use rice as their main ingredient. And that's really one of the most fundamental reasons. That established the boundary that I was working with. And then because you need to deal with rice beer that people can acquire easily in the United States, it really limits yourself to more kind of like big brewery type of names like Sapporo or Tsingtao. And at first I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I want to put that on the list. These are things that people have probably had a lot of or have just completely had something like it, I would say. But I ended up just really kind of, once I had the rest of the list set, I was like, no, this is a really good difference from the rest of what's happening. A, because it's much lighter, which is kind of welcome after a while. And B, just because it really highlights the different side of what a beer can be and what rice can do for a beer. And nowadays we think about a lot as something that's like very light and very crisp and very clean. Or there are some people that hold like a negative connotation with rice as kind of like something that you use to stretch a batch of beer. And that might be true in some breweries, but it's definitely not ubiquitously true. And so I did include the Hitachino Red Nest Ale as like a subsidiary. I haven't been able to find it to try it, unfortunately. And I suspect that people will often struggle to find maybe that specific one. But that kind of beer is a different take on a rice beer where you have a more aggressive rice flavor. It's a very specific type of rice that's cultivated. It's the only grain that's used in the beer.
Oh, wow.
And so there's kind of the two sides of rice. And that was that idea. The wheat beer was chosen because we'll be drinking that when we're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, which is similar to the ancient Chinese stop. It is a situation where you have the very first wheat being domesticated in a region at the same time as you have the very first beer being made in a region. And so, there's this constant ebb and flow of arguments between archaeologists and anthropologists, like which came first? Did people settle down to grow wheat to bake beer, to make beer and bake bread? Or instead, did people start settling down and then as a consequence, they could, grow all this grain? And so some people will say that beer is one of the reasons that people started living in cities in the ancient Near East, which I find really interesting as a kind of thought experiment. It's a sort of chicken and egg question. And so wheat clearly is the main star of that stop. What else do we have? We have the Guinness for Egypt. So I chose Guinness in this case because it's a low alcohol beer that's very filling and it has a roasted malt. And so those things all kind of come together to form a really nice representation of the idea of ancient Egyptian beer, because they're the first group in the ancient Near East to start to actually cook their wort, and they're roasting the beer product. Whereas in Mesopotamia, they just kind of soaked the grains in water and left it like that, and then they would drink out of that kind of soaking liquid. In Egypt, you're actually cooking the beer for the first time. And so this kind of roasted grain flavor evokes that idea of cooking. While at the same time, most Egyptian beer is very, very low alcohol content, and it's meant to be very filling because it's really a substantial part of every ancient Egyptian's diet from the time they're maybe 2 or 3 years old until they die. And so Guinness really evokes a lot of that.
I can get behind that idea.
Yeah, exactly, right? It doesn't seem too bad a life, really.
That's really interesting. I never would have imagined linking Guinness to ancient Egypt, but I'm glad you explained that to me.
Yeah, it's not, obviously, if you look too hard, right, a lot of these equivalences fall apart. And part of that's just because people don't use hops to make beer until the 1400s.
That's right.
And you can't really find unhopped beer in the modern world. It's a very different thing. And so really,
yeah. But
Yeah.
before we let you go, you mentioned Chicha. Chicha's one of the weirder beers in the world. And I'll set you up by saying that there's starch, the barley, the grain, in this case it's corn, and the starches have to be changed into a form that can eventually become sugar, which will ferment, because that's what the yeast want to eat. How did they do that with Chicha? How did they make that conversion happen? Mark?
Exactly. Yeah. So this is great. And this also actually really links into the book you were talking about earlier, Beth, which is just a woman's places in the brew house. Because Chicha, first of all, is traditionally made only by women, which I find really interesting and kind of against a lot of what people, at least in the modern US, think of when they think of a brewer. Like a lot of people stereotypically think of a man making some kind of like hopped drink or you think of like ancient Belgian monks, right? Medieval Belgian monks. And so this idea of like local community women making batches of corn beer in their backyard and selling it out of their porch is in total violation of what a lot of people assume making and selling beer is. And so I love it from that kind of standard. But the actual process of preparing the material for chicha is fascinating because it involves actually chewing the corn. And so what you're doing is you take a dried corn and you grind it up into this coarse cornmeal. Traditionally, this would have been on kind of like a grinding stone, but now you can just use a blender or something if you want to try this at home. Chicha is actually very simple to make at home if it's a sort of experiment that you want. You don't need any kind of big brewing setup. You just need a space on the counter and 6 days and a lot of jaw muscle. So you grind this up and then you actually just kind of put little bits of it in your mouth at a time. And chewing isn't necessarily the right word, and it kind of gives the wrong impression because if you chew this stuff, it's really bad for your teeth actually, because it's just hard bits of corn. And so what you're actually doing is you're just kind of soaking it in your saliva, which sounds really, really gross. But you kind of take it out, and over the course of 24 hours, the natural enzymes in our saliva, specifically one called amylase, will break down the complex sugars in the corn, and they will create a more digestible form of sugar that the yeast can eat. And so this wild yeast will then kind of permeate into this chicha mash, and it can actually start to eat and ferment these more simple sugars. And it is totally sanitary to eat because it's always, you boil it for 30 or 45 minutes after you start to ferment this material. But it's really interesting what, just human saliva as a method of preparation can do, right? You can take like a saltine too and stick it on your tongue. And if you just leave it there and if you don't chew it, for anyone who's watching, if you want like an example of this, after all the salt taste goes away and you just let it sit there, it'll start to turn really sweet actually, maybe a minute or two in, and it'll taste like sugar. And it's the exact same process that's happening in chicha. It's kind of these complex carbohydrates that are being broken down.
Well, that was a really, really good explanation. And I was glad you got to the point of when they boil it.
Yes, yeah. No, it's totally sanitary to eat, especially, in modern COVID conscious times.
Well, look, I know you're trying to get on planes, so we're going to let you go. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. But before you go, safe travels, by the way.
Thank you.
Before you go, just give us the details on the event once more, and before we say goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the event is at 6 p.m. next Friday, November the 19th. It runs from 6 to 8. And you don't need to buy a ticket per person. It's just ticket per viewing platform. And so you could gather, 8, 12 people around a single TV or computer, and one ticket's good enough for that.
Oh, thank you for the blessing to do that.
Yes, no, of course. I have no qualms about that. It makes sense. So that sort of material, is very accessible. I highly recommend it. Like I said, you'll see some objects that we don't always talk about. There's also going to be a brief appearance of pulque, which isn't technically a beer, but I think it's worth talking about if you've never heard it. It's like a cousin to tequila that the ancient Aztecs drank.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah.
Well, we're really looking forward to it, and really appreciate you taking the time to give us a sneak preview.
Of course, it was a real pleasure to do this.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you too, Mark.
Thank you.
Safe travels, and we'll see you next Friday.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All right, cheers. Wave, Gunga.